Welcome to this new Minerva discussion series, Making Sense of the Coronavirus Crisis. I'm Professor Brad Evans, and I'll be the host for these sessions. The Minerva lecture series provides an opportunity to share the latest research, which is carried out at the University of Bath, and usually held on the Bath's campus. We've recently moved online as part of social distancing measures. Now, the lecture series is very much seen as an interface between the university and local and wider communities. So we're delighted that you could join us here today. Now, to make sense of these uncertain times, we are inviting 4 panels of experts from the University of Bath to share their expertise. And the topics will include over the coming weeks the social and political effects, which we deal with today, the science of the virus, health and well-being impacts, and the impact on economics and businesses. Now, for today's session, I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of great colleagues, including Professor David Galbreath, who is a Professor of International Security and Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Jennifer Thomson, who is a lecturer in Comparative Politics, along with Professor Nick Pearce, who is a Professor of Public Policy and also the Director of the Institute for Policy Research. So how do we make sense of this pandemic? And what does the pandemic mean for our societies? There are many ways in which the pandemic has already been explained to us. Now, to my mind, perhaps one of the most useful is to see it as an event. Seeing the pandemic as an event allows us to recognize its unexpected arrival as a kind of a break in the fabric of our societies. This also means that we need to account for its global and its local effects, along with its transformative qualities. Now, that the pandemic seems global to us perhaps is quite self-evident. We know the virus recognizes no borders. But how are we to understand the security implications of this? This is an issue which Professor Galbreath will be addressing. When we turn to the local level, what we are effectively dealing with is the politics and the social implications of everyday life, the politics of the home, the politics of the family, and everyday operations of power, especially gender. This is an issue which will be addressed by Dr. Thomson. And finally, when thinking about the transformative potential, what we are also dealing with is ideas concerning societies to come. Indeed, what is the future going to look like after this event? Professor Pearce will be offering his reflections and dealing with this in his contribution. Now, as this session is live, you will see at the bottom of your bar an option to submit questions to the Q&A session, which will follow. And I do strongly encourage you to please submit your questions, and we will try to deal with a number of them at the end of the session. So without further ado, again, welcome to this session, and I will now pass you over to our first speaker, who is Professor David Galbreath.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start by talking about an experience that I have growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, in the United States. And one of the interesting things in Memphis is that if you drive around, you'll notice that there are quite a few cemeteries, old cemeteries from the beginning of the 20th century. And that those cemeteries, they're fantastic cemeteries because they're quite classic cemeteries, and they have big trees and in areas where have been cleared with a lot of trees and so on. Really kind of refuges in an urban area. And what's remarkable is that actually they're yellow fever cemeteries. And so what happened in the early 20th century, actually late 19th century and early 20th century, is that Memphis had yellow fever epidemics. And what's interesting about these yellow fever epidemics is both the local political implications, but also how they tied to the international. The local implications were that it seemed like Black or African-American individuals were really quite immune. In fact, they weren't immune, but they looked like they were quite immune to the virus that came from the mosquito. But in fact, what was happening is that the white communities were susceptible. And in fact, they really fled outside the city. These transitions really impacted, or these events really impacted on how the demographics worked across the city and across several cities in the South of the United States. But interestingly enough, the yellow fever was actually brought over, the virus that causes the yellow fever was brought over through the slave trade. And so the reason why many African Americans seem to have had an immunity is because actually, the slave trade being from West Africa, or that parentage from West Africa, that they had built up an immunity, or at least more of an immunity towards the virus. So in fact, that even in this case, where it seemed to have this very local effect between white and black communities in Memphis itself, it had this connection to an international trade. And in this case, it was the international trade of human beings. And one of the interesting things here is that how that was discussed really in the context of insecurity. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is this notion of insecurity, because white communities in Memphis, Tennessee, especially understood this virus, or this pandemic, as the way that they would have understood it, as an insecurity. Now, they would have understood it in racial terms and political terms and many other terms, and I won't unpack all of those today. But what I do want to talk about really is this notion of, when something like this kind of crisis happens, really, how do we identify the crisis? How do we then name the crisis? And then how do we then go on to kind of build on from that? And all those things are, in a sense, kind of linked together. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in. One of the great debates, philosophical debates, that there is really this notion of how do we identify crisis. And as you can see, we talked about this, or the Minerva series has really talked about this in terms of the coronavirus crisis. And the notion of crisis in particular is this is something that has been highly contested in philosophy, all the way to Aristotle understanding this kind of like, as soon as the fissure happens, then the crisis has happened, and to Heidegger talking about this notion that actually the crisis is something that doesn't occur until we've recognized that the fissure has happened, and so really this notion, or this disagreement then that was carried on by Nietzsche and other philosophers afterwards, that this notion of crisis itself, as the way that we started to think about it, had distinct political and social connotations, and I think that, and again, that's really what we're going to talk about today. The political or the social connotation that I want to talk about really is around security, or securitization, or in a sense, as it's been talked about, is insecuritization. And the notion is that traditionally security was thought about within the context of how we would ordinarily think about national security, if we were to say that. This notion of national security as being something that happens between states. Sometimes it happens within states, but it happens, when you have civil wars. But mostly it's something that happens between states, and is distinctly, in a sense, international, and it's distinctly political, right? And then, in particular, after the Second World War, we had political really thinkers or philosophers that were thinking about security in different ways. And there's, in particular, there was an academic in the 1960s, Johann Galtung, who published some very interesting work in the late 1960s and the early 70s around how do we change this notion of security, or how do we, in a sense, root it into something, So if it's something, if we think about security as like threat to our lives, for instance, threat to human lives, then surely we should think about security in some way else. And he cited at the time, how many people die in automobile accidents in Europe and North America at that time. How many people die of, say, influenza at that time, and things like this, to say that actually the whole notion of security that we have in terms of military or militarized security actually is totally misplaced. It's misplaced, especially in an era of what seemed like a long peace, as John Lewis Gaddis talked about it after the Cold War, that we had this long peace. And of course, that there's particular problems with the notion of peace where many wars were going on, but there you go. But Johann Galtung had this kind of impact on the way that we thought about security, as kind of opening it up, that security, in a sense, wasn't a given. It was something to be questioned and unpacked in a way. And then later on, we had these notions of saying, okay, well, how does security happen then? What is, if we can talk about everything as security, then all of a sudden security doesn't make a difference, or doesn't matter any longer. And this is where, in a sense, we think we can, other people have tried to come into terms of thinking about, well, is it actions? Is it every time that we have a policy or every time that we organize? We have local councils, for instance, making decisions about the way that businesses can or cannot open, for instance. Is this, in a sense, securitizing the coronavirus in a way, is to say, in a sense, we have to reorder society in order to prevent it? Others argued, and what have been referred to often as the Copenhagen School, because of Ollie Weaver in particular, who was at the University of Copenhagen, or is at the University of Copenhagen, was particularly interested in the speech acts, and the speech acts that were particularly important in understanding security or securitization, because the argument is that actually apolitically nothing is security, right? Only through politics, only through some kind of political oration, do you arrive at security. And this is the notion around securitization. And so something has to be securitized. And what Ollie Weaver and others like Barry Buzan and so on, what they were particularly interested in is this notion of the Speech Act. That through calling something security, calling something a crisis even, that we kind of we put certain kind of meaning into it in some way or another. And this led on to others like Didier Bigot and Terry Balzac and others talking about this idea of understanding security. Really, kind of, actually, you can see it through lots of different layers. You can see it through kind of anthropological layers and sociological layers. But even more than that, we ordinarily would think about security, some security issues, as being like a health issue, or maybe we can think about it as a harm issue, or maybe that we can think about it as a safety issue, and so on. And what's happened is that all those different types of meanings of safety and health and protection and things like this, all those things in a sense have the ability to become a security issue, or in fact what they refer to as kind of a security moment. That we've in a sense securitized an issue, and we can think about this not only within the context of something like the coronavirus, and I'll give some examples of how it's been talked about in terms of coronavirus, but in particular, if we think about within the context of something like immigration, for instance, or the way that we think about minority communities, or the way that we understand the way that certain states are acting or being portrayed to us, for instance. Many of those things can be securitized and have been securitized. I mean, in fact, that's what the original Copenhagen School was particularly interested in, is, how do we go about trying to identify how, the concern over immigration arises? Because it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It happens in this kind of political and communication space. And so this, in a sense, kind of, brings us to, in a sense, a bigger discussion around how you may understand coronavirus as something like security, or how we may understand it as security. And I would point you to, as I said on Twitter earlier today, Costanza Musso, who's at the University of Ottawa, wrote a very interesting piece for the conversation. And what was particularly interesting about it is that she discusses this notion of, in a sense, the way that we would respond to coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic as being particularly a war, in a way that she cites, Matt Hancock, who's the health secretary, as saying, the measures that I have outlined are unprecedented in peacetime. We will fight this virus with everything we have. We are in a war against an invisible killer, and we have to do everything we can to stop it. That's a very particular language, And she argues, that we're not citizens in this any longer. We are soldiers in this conflict, and as such, politicians call for our obedience rather than awareness, and appeal to our patriotism, not to mention our solidarity. And so this presents, in a sense, our challenges, the way that we would ordinarily think about a health issue, when we, in a sense, turn it into a war issue. And many or in a sense, a martial issue, I should say. This idea that we're marshalling ourselves, which calls for a different type of what Buzan and Ollie Weaver talked about in terms of emergency politics. That we arrive at emergency politics, which allows us to actually expect different things from the government, but also allow and our fellow citizens, if you will, but also in a sense the government expects different things from us, and so it redoes the basis on which we would understand some kind of national contract, if you will. And so the real struggle then becomes, in a sense, how do we, in a sense, desecuritize? How do we the coronavirus, in a way, not only do we understand it as, in a sense, something that we have to fight a battle against, like the war on drugs or something like this, that this thing out there that's coming, for us. But, we can understand it also within the context of a larger geopolitical thing, in the way that in the United States, especially the Trump administration refers to it as the China virus, for instance. It is not unpoliticized in this way. It has been heavily securitized. And so the question then becomes, how do we go the other direction? How do we start to try to pull these things apart? And this is where my own research has really focused, because what I've been interested in is how do you go about trying to take away the emergency politics? How do you return back to normal politics? And actually, what we find is that speech acts in particular, and actions, but speech acts become as important as in a sense, regardless of what else is happening in the material world, if you know what I mean. And in fact, that actually the desecuritization, so really in a sense taking something that has been securitized back into normal politics, is something that really is. Really uses many of the same tools of which we got there to begin with, and therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem of when do you turn, when do you press the accelerator and when do you press the brake? Because in many cases it's the same tools at hand that allow us to understand coronavirus either in one way or another. So what I think is particularly interesting, and what we're going to talk about today in particular is the way that and how we've understood the coronavirus in these variety of different ways, and how my fellow panelists are going to discuss them in particular, what I would refer to as a securitized kind of milieu in a way, but we'll see how they respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your contribution, and a whole number of really interesting points which came through. And I think the first is a healthy reminder that what we're facing is, even though it has a lot of new kind of qualities, but also, there's a history to these kind of pandemics that we have to be mindful of. And also, I think that the point around the idea of the security imperative seems very prescient to us to try to make sense of, especially the shift towards militarization. And I'm sure we will discuss this much later. But this idea of, because a security, if you make someone a security concern, then there's an imperative that we act, but we act in a very particular way often. And it seems very compelling to draw upon the war metaphor, but there are very serious political dangers of doing so. Okay, I will now pass over to Dr. Jennifer Thomson, who will engage us more in the question of gender and the gendered significance of this.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you for the invitation to take part today in this panel. So obviously we know that pandemics are biological occurrences, but they happen in a social world, and they happen in a social world that we know is already very deeply unequal in many ways. And in news coverage of the pandemic so far, you've probably seen that it's having the worst health impact on older people and on older men in particular. And it also seems to be having a disproportionate impact on BME NHS workers as well. What I want to do, though, in my section this afternoon is focus not on the viral impact of the disease, but rather think about the broader social world in which it's playing out. And in particular, thinking about the impact that COVID is having on these already existent gender inequalities within our society. So I want to think about some of the ways that the pandemic might exacerbate gender inequality in the future, and also some of the areas that governments and policymakers need to be cognizant of in order to minimise that gendered impact. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas. I'm going to talk about the impact that COVID-19 is having on women in terms of their safety and security. I'm going to talk about women's employment and working life. And then finally, I want to touch briefly on the issue of women's representation during the crisis. So first off, to think about safety and security, I think the most obvious and distressing impact here to talk about is the issue of domestic violence. We've seen an almost global lockdown over the past few months, with the vast majority of people confined to their homes. There's been a huge resultant uptick in reports of gender-based domestic violence, with many women forced to share homes with abusers or continue to live in violent situations. So to just think about the United Kingdom, in early April, Refuge, which is the UK's largest domestic violence charity, they reported a 120% increase in calls to their helpline. There has also been reports suggesting that domestic femicide in the UK has doubled compared with statistics from the last 5 years. And these are figures that we've seen replicated elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere around the world. Governments have been responding to this. For example, in France made about 20,000 hotel rooms available for domestic abuse victims to leave their home if necessary. We've also seen a social media campaign in this country fronted by Home Secretary Priti Patel. But if we are in a situation where lockdown or social distancing is going to continue for many more weeks or perhaps months, this does need, I think, to be at the top of the priority list for governments, in particularly thinking about how domestic services can be supported at this time, and financially and in other means, and also how they can be mobilised to reach women in violent or controlling situations at the moment. To continue on the theme of safety and security, I think the second main area to touch on here is healthcare. Health emergencies obviously make it more difficult for people to access regular health services, and this can have particular gendered impacts if we think about the specific types of healthcare that women require. And I'm thinking here in particular about maternal and sexual and reproductive healthcare. These can be seen as areas of low priority in times of crisis, and areas where resources can be reallocated from them and transferred to more immediate frontline services as the crisis goes on. Pregnant women can also be more reticent to seek out healthcare out of a fear of contracting the virus. This can potentially lead to higher deaths or problems during pregnancy and childbirth. Equally, if we see resources stripped from areas like sexual and reproductive health care, this can lead to a rise in unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases. Furthermore, in areas where sexual and reproductive health and rights are already very politicised, this can be a window of opportunity in which lawmakers try to further restrict access to these services. And we've seen this happen across a number of national settings in the course of the COVID pandemic, from Texas to Poland. Women are also at specific risk during a pandemic because of the gendered makeup of the global healthcare service. Women make up about 70% of the global health workforce, and they're also more likely to be present in frontline roles, especially in nursing and especially in community-based healthcare work. Indeed, again, if we just think about the United Kingdom, women have made up around 60% of the nurses and midwives who have died of COVID-19 in the course of the pandemic so far. And as I mentioned earlier, we've also seen a highly disproportionate number of BME NHS employees dying as well. Also, the ongoing issues around PPE that we've heard so much about in this country. PPE is largely designed for male bodies. This means that it's often too large for the female-dominated workforce to wear properly. This means that it can be very uncomfortable to wear for long periods of time for the women wearing it, and it can also be completely ineffective at actually doing its job and keeping them safe. Okay, so moving on to think about the impact that COVID has had so far on women's working life and employment more generally. And I want firstly just to think about the impact that working from home and the transition to working from home for so many people, what impact that's having on women. Obviously, again, in multiple countries around the world, we've seen the closure of schools and nurseries. That means that there's an enormous burden of healthcare and homeschooling on parents. This obviously has huge ramifications for fathers as well as mothers, but in terms of what we know about unequal trends in domestic arrangements, in terms of caregiving around the globe, this is again a burden which largely falls on women. We know that women often already do a second shift of homework compared to men. This is likely to be exacerbated in the current circumstances, and if that continues, it could have repercussions moving beyond COVID-19 in terms of career progression. Indeed, just thinking about academia, academic journals have been reporting in the last few weeks and months that there's been a very strong gender difference in article submissions, far more men submitting work over the last few months than women, which is very interesting. Across the world, we've obviously also seen unprecedented measures taken to shore up national economies, including guaranteeing salaries. However, at a global level, around 70% of women's employment is in the informal sector. That means that women are obviously much more likely to miss out on these government-backed schemes and to miss out on the types of legal and social protections which are being designed to provide some sort of financial stability during the pandemic. And then just lastly, in terms of employment, it's obviously becoming increasingly apparent as time goes on that the economic impact of COVID-19 is going to be felt for many years to come. And we know that economic recessions, when they result in particular in cuts to government spending, are more likely to impact women than men. We know that women are more likely than men to be employed by the state. And we know that women are more likely than men to be beneficiaries of the state, especially in terms of welfare spending. So an appreciation of the particular gendered impact of a financial downturn is, I think, really key to policymakers to trying to ensure that any further measures don't have an overly detrimental impact on women. And just lastly, to end on a quick note about representation and women's representation during the crisis so far, I think it's been particularly noticeable in the United Kingdom in terms of the daily broadcasts from Number 10. These daily briefings have been incredibly male-dominated so far. And I think they've acted as quite a stark reminder that the United Kingdom is still very unrepresentative when we think about our politics, when we think about our civil service, our scientific, our academic fields. And indeed, the makeup of the SAGE committee, which is advising government on COVID-19, released to the press a couple of weeks ago, was a very clear indicator of that, about only a quarter of those members being women. So I think in the light of that kind of paucity of representation, it's difficult to hope that the response to COVID-19 is going to be inclusive when decision-making so far has been really the preserve of a gendered and racial elite. The pandemic really is at risk of exacerbating gendered inequalities in our world, and we really need to be cognizant and aware of that as we hopefully start to move beyond it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jennifer. I think your contribution, raises a whole number of important points, and there is that kind of thing that people say about one thing about a crisis, it can reveal what's already broken in our societies. One of the things that you're talking about, of course, is that it does shine a light and concentrate our attention on areas which are of a very clear kind of domestic concern for us. And also, I think you kind of break down in an important way this kind of myth that we're all in this together. Or if we are all in this together, people's experience of the crisis is very different. And I think that's certainly worth considering and bearing in mind as we move forward in terms of the conversation. Okay, I would now like to turn to our final contributor, who's Professor Nick Pearce. And so over to you, Nick. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Brad, and thank you to everybody tuning in for the session this afternoon. I want to talk a little bit about how a crisis of this kind can lead to change, and how different societies respond to major crises, and why they do so in very different ways. And in the academic literature, this kind of pandemic crisis or moment of profound shock to societies is often described as a critical juncture, a moment in which lots of things are thrown up in the air, different things can change in a society. And in particular, when academics look at these sorts of moments, these critical junctures, they think about the mechanisms by which this kind of economic, societal transformation, or indeed lack of change, happens. And there are three ways or three things that we should think about in that regard. The first is the antecedent conditions. What was happening before the crisis struck? What was happening in society, in our economies before the crisis? The second is the kinds of institutions we have in a society, which condition, if you like, the sorts of responses we make. So what are our economic, our political institutions, the ways in which we construct our welfare states and so on? How have they evolved over history, giving us an institutional framework that then is impacted by the crisis and helps us think about how we are conditioned in our response? And then finally, what are the kind of actions of political and other economic actors in the crisis? Who takes the crisis and uses it as an opportunity for change? How do people make use of a crisis, particularly political agents, for that kind of transformation? So on this first point about antecedent conditions, it's really important to recognise, of course, that the COVID-19 pandemic is the second major global economic crisis we've had in little over a decade. And how our institutions, our central banks, our governments, our local authorities and others have responded to the crisis, to the pandemic crisis, reflects the recent history of the global financial crisis and its aftermath. And I think that happens and is visible in at least three different ways. The first is the actions of our central banks. The second is the fiscal policy responses from governments. And then the third is the whole question of globalization and the retreat from a certain way of thinking about economic globalization. So on the first of these questions, on central banks, we've seen in the last few months massive interventions into global markets by central banks around the world. The Fed in particular in the US has made huge interventions in the global dollar markets, in swap lines to emerging markets, into asset purchases in the US, buying up in the secondary markets government bonds, buying up corporate bonds and so on. Now, a lot of this has been done because a lot of those measures took place during the global financial crisis for the first time. Very big quantitative easing processes in the UK, the US and elsewhere, major cuts in interest rates, the expansion of dollar swap lines and so on. A lot of these mechanisms that we've seen in the last few months have reached a much bigger scale than ever before, but they were, if you like, they were tried, and central banks got used to using these mechanisms, European Central Bank, Bank of England, in particular Bank of Japan and the Fed, in the financial crisis. So what was taking place before has meant that they'd learned a set of tools that they could deploy this time around, albeit at a much bigger scale. People indeed, I think it's been said of the Fed in the US that instead of the United States being a country with a central bank, it's become a central bank with a country. Such is the scale of what the Fed has done. The second area where the antecedent conditions have affected crisis responses is in fiscal measures, like the furloughing measures we've seen in the UK, other big interventions around the world. In the UK, something like £300 billion will be the size of our deficit this year on the public finances. That is the deficit between what we're taking in tax and what we're spending. That's the highest since World War II. It's even bigger when we look at the measures governments have taken in places like Japan. 20% of GDP in Japan being thrown at this crisis. In the US, something like 15% of GDP. Again, a lot of this flows from the experience of the great financial crisis in 2008. The governments learned that in the midst of a crisis of this kind, you have to intervene to stabilize an economy, to prevent it becoming a financial crisis that deepens and weakens your economy, and to uphold spending. The big difference this time, it seems to me, is that precisely because that financial crisis was followed in the UK, in the Eurozone and elsewhere by austerity, by cuts in public spending in particular to repair deficits and government debts, that experience has meant there's far less talk now of responding to this crisis by further cutting public spending. Even people on the conservative right who said after the financial crisis that the only way that this can be dealt with is through cuts in public spending, even they have started to abandon that language and talk much more about the need for growth to repair the public finances over a long period of time, rather than cuts in public spending. So that seems to me again to be an important determinant of how the crisis has been responded to and what might come in the future. The third area is globalization. Of course, before the crisis struck, there was already a trade war between the US and China, Trump's tariffs and so on. Many people already saying that global trade was falling, that the high watermark of economic globalization had been passed. In the crisis itself now, the WTO believes that world trade will reduce by about a third. It's a huge amount. The World Bank expects remittances from migrants to their home countries to fall by 20%. Now, nobody thinks that we're going to return to national autarky, to self-sufficient economies, or indeed even to the kind of post-war world of largely enclosed national economies within the framework of the Bretton Woods Agreement. But it's clear that the kind of globalization that we had isn't coming back in the way that we did have it. We've seen a new focus on national resilience, countries talking about strategic products and processes and the manufacturing of those products that they need to have in their own countries, diagnostic testing, public health, health supplies, food supplies, and so on. Other big multilaterals with big supply chains around the world pursuing what's called China Plus One strategies, where instead of having everything manufactured in China, oh, it looks like I'm leaving the meeting. I got cut off there. Am I back? I hope so. Sorry about that. So supply chains being reconfigured, more investment in places like Vietnam and other Asian countries rather than it all being China. And the president of France, President Macron, giving a very interesting interview recently in the Financial Times, saying that the cycle of globalization that we were in was already ending before the crisis, and the crisis has been an anthropological event. It has changed how we see ourselves relating to the rest of the world. And the kind of global public goods that we want to advance aren't just about trade, they're about public health, they're about the environment and so on. Now, just moving quickly to institutions, how our society responds to the crisis also depends on the institutions it has. Very good way of thinking about this is the labour market responses different countries have made. So across most of Europe, governments have intervened to give companies money to keep their workers in their jobs. They furloughed them, as we've done in the UK. In places like Germany, the kind of coordinated structure of their capitalist economies means they've had long-standing arrangements for the state, for trade unions and employers to work together to make sure that people don't lose their jobs. So when the recovery comes, their skills are still there, they can still be employed. In the US, we've seen instead of that kind of response, just a lot of money being sent to individuals in checks, but also to companies in bailouts. It hasn't been tied to employment. We haven't seen the same kind of furlough schemes. And that's meant that US unemployment has risen much more dramatically than it has in Europe. That reflects the institutions of a much more liberal market economy in the US, where they're far less used to working with trade unions and employers in a more coordinated way. That is the case in continental Europe. And the very interesting thing is why the UK, which is always thought of as a much more liberal economy like the US, has responded with a furlough scheme as it has, much more European looking, where the state has intervened to subsidise the jobs of something like 7.5 million people in Britain, about a quarter of our employees. It's a huge shift. And whether we retain that focus on the legitimacy of the state intervening in this kind of way, of trade unions and employers and the state negotiating as they've done in the UK on the furlough scheme, whether we maintain that will be a very interesting question for the future. And finally, within a country, its institutions also matter. So when we think about the care home deaths we've experienced in the UK, with people dying in great numbers in care homes, that has its roots that go very deep in British society. And back to 1948, when we created the National Health Service, we created an institution which privileged hospitals and care in hospitals and kept care of people who were poor or ill or needing services in their homes in local authority provision. It was paid for by local authorities. Social care, care of the elderly in particular, was kept distinct from the National Health Service. So when the crisis struck, the government slogan was protect the NHS. We didn't think enough about protecting people in care homes, testing, PPE equipment, all those sorts of things that took place in the community and particularly in the care sector. And that reflects this institutional history, this separation between the NHS and social care, the privileging of power in the National Health Service in the acute sector, in the hospitals, rather than community settings. So those kinds of institutional histories very much impact on how we respond as societies. Final area then, political agency, just to finish on this. How do political parties, movements and others respond to a crisis like this? How do they shape it towards their own ends? Well, one big area, it seems to me, that we should talk about is our relationship to the environment, climate change, and at the root of this, the kind of colonization of nature, the fact that this pandemic originated in a species transfer from a bat to a human being, redolent of the fact that we have colonized areas of biodiversity. Does this mean that we'll have a reset of our relationship with nature? Adam Tooze, the American historian, has called this the first economic crisis of the Anthropocene. And whether we respond to it in that way, I think will be a test of our political movements and the strength of those in our society. So at the global level, will we take forward more developments to tackle climate change in a coordinated way, or will we fall into a China versus US geopolitical standoff? Will the EU be able to get its act together in a way that it hasn't in recent weeks? We see a much more optimistic story at the city level, with city leaders in London, in Milan and other cities moving quickly to take over road space from cars, to begin to think about using the crisis to promote walking and cycling, resetting the urban environment. A lot of these movements, these green movements in the past, have been driven by young people, by the cosmopolitan middle class, if you like, in our societies. Are they able to use this crisis to begin to consolidate their political rise, or will we see reactionary and conservative forces which have also been politically victorious, particularly in Eastern Europe, in the US and elsewhere, using the crisis to consolidate an economic narrative and about the cementing of existing established institutions? And that question of how political actors and the forces behind them respond to the crisis will, I think, affect very much how whether we see transformation of a fundamental kind in our relationship to nature in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your contribution, Nick. And I think there's a whole load to digest through that, and particularly this point around how different countries have responded to the crisis based on what they were doing previously. And the idea that actually Britain's responding more in a manner akin to Europe and the United States of America is certainly very interesting given the post-Brexit environment. And I'm sure there's so much to actually be discussed through that. But also, I think another important point, which actually will lead us on now to our first question, actually, is this question which Nick raises around who do we actually care for in our societies? And this seems to be one of the most fundamental questions that we have to face as any given society. If the hallmark of our societies is the kind of care we deliver to people, then how do we ensure that we care for the most vulnerable in those societies? And the question that has been raised by one of the first questions given to us is, when we focus on this question of security, which was raised by David's contribution, are we often kind of forgetting of the day-to-day insecurities which were also raised, particularly questions around the security of household, the security of employment, and especially the security of health, especially the security of the elderly? So what would it mean to reconceptualize our understanding even of security in these terms? Or indeed, how can we have a better understanding of social policy which recognizes precisely the fundamental insecurities of the everyday and how this might link to care? So I will go through each of these speakers in turn and in the order from David to Jennifer and then to Nick in their responses to these questions.
Yeah, I mean, personally, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that the interesting thing is that, of course, traditionally social policy in the United States has been referred to as social security, and making it very much an issue of a factor of survival, if you will. And of course, in many cases where you have a very small institutional state, it is a matter of security rather than policy. But one of the interesting things is this discussion, and I think the discussion that was going on in the 1970s in particular, of which I mentioned earlier, Johan Galtung was part of, was again this notion that actually we should be thinking about security differently. Traditionally we may think about politics in terms of like high politics and low politics, and the argument is that actually, the high politics and low politics metaphor actually confuses things, because in many cases it's the everyday politics that really matter for people, and in fact it's the everyday politics that have explained, in many cases for many people and for many analysts. Or analysts rather, it is explained, 2016 and in many other areas. It's really that the kind of the local, the personal, or the everyday politics. And so, but the question in particular is how do we in a sense kind of construct or formulate a social or a policy response that means that actually we're going to think about the housing issues and the social policy issues as being distinctly a matter of government, or in a sense a priority of government. I would say in a sense, there have been governments in the past in the UK that have actually tried to put those first and foremost as areas of the greatest concern, but obviously that is that has been largely done through Labour governments over the years, and since the 1980s and onwards, we've seen in a sense a privatization in many cases in that space, to the point to where, as Professor Pearce was saying, that we've ended up divorcing ourselves from thinking about those social policy issues as being distinctly health social or socio-economic health issues, that we've actually distinguished them. And so this focus instead on acute medicine, which is where we feel like we have we have this very kind of concise area of treatment, seems so much more simpler. I mean, even though many people will point to the connection between the larger issues, or as you have in your question, around housing and social policy, and how it's distinctly related to acute medicine.
Thank you. I like the way that you originally paraphrased the question, Brad, as saying this is an issue of who do we care for, and who do we decide who is, I guess, worthy of care in some respects. And I think just to go back to what you said earlier about the idea that what a crisis is in some ways is that it is throwing into stark relief things that are already there and have been there for a long time. And I think this is absolutely the case in terms of COVID, and absolutely the case in terms of the things that I was speaking about earlier in relation to gender. We've known for so long that domestic violence is a huge issue. We've known for so long the very feminized nature of our NHS, our care workers, etc., etc. And I think one positive from COVID is that we now know that more clearly than ever. It has been shown to us, on our national media on a daily basis. We now know more clearly than ever of these issues, and a blind eye can no longer be turned to them. So in some ways, I think there is perhaps a reason to be positive in terms of trying to think around reconceptualizations of security and reconceptualizations of value and caring, etc. In that, for example, just in terms of the huge outpouring of admiration and respect that we've seen for the NHS in terms of people clapping on their front doorsteps every week. So in some cases, I think there's a reason to be really positive about moving into the future. People have been made more aware of these issues and have responded very positively in some ways. But I think in other ways, there's also a lot to be concerned about and worried about in the future, especially thinking about sort of more broader state level questions of national security, for example. And it was interesting, very early on in the early stages of the crisis, we saw borders being closed down within the European Union. For example, we saw things like the United States, Trump trying to reach out to procure vaccines for the United States and the United States alone. So we also very immediately saw kind of a retreat to that national level and a retreat to thinking first and foremost about the boundaries of the nation and nobody else. And we've even seen that to a certain extent, I think it's fair to say, within the United Kingdom. There's definitely been a little bit of playing off between central government in London and the devolved institutions in Cardiff and Edinburgh and Belfast. So I think there are both potential positives and potential negatives as we move forward to thinking about that question of who do we care for and who do we need to think about when we think about looking after ourselves and our neighbours.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I'll just concentrate on the welfare state social security side of things. I think one of the things about this crisis that's very interesting is that it's no longer possible to argue that whether people are unemployed or in poverty is a result of their own fecklessness or individual moral deficiencies. It's simply impossible to say that in a crisis of this kind. And so whether we see a kind of a fundamental change in our attitudes to those kinds of social risks, I think will be a really interesting consequence of this crisis. What we've definitely seen is that our welfare state and our social security safety net in the UK is full of holes. It's no longer adequate for the kind of labour market we have in particular, that it hasn't proved able to support people who are self-employed or in the gig economy. It's been a real struggle for the Treasury in very quick time, actually, to try to produce the kinds of schemes that can support people's incomes in those processes. Ironically, the fact that the Department of Work and Pensions with the Universal Credit went online and required digital by default for access to Universal Credit some years ago meant that actually we didn't have a situation where thousands, millions of people were turning up at dole offices, as would have been the case in the 1980s, and try and imagine the social distancing that would have been required there would have been utterly unmanageable. But we've definitely seen real problems in our welfare state and social security, holes in the safety net, people in our labour market not catered for by the provision we have, and therefore a lot of talk and a lot of focus on things like universal basic income, where people are saying everybody needs a guaranteed minimum income. So when crises like these hit, we don't have to go through the process of difficult applications for benefits that are means tested and conditional and subject to sanctions and all the rest of it. So again, I think this is an area where the crisis has opened up debate about social security and how we reform our welfare state in potentially really important ways.
Thanks very much for those questions. So there's so many questions which I could draw upon you, but I think I'm going to just, mindful of time, we only have some 8 minutes left. So I'm going to put 2 questions in one and allow the speakers to have one final response on this before wrapping the session up for today. The first question is from Tim, which concerns militarization and the expenditure on militarization. And Tim's pointed out that we actually spend $2 trillion every year on militarization. So are we better off reinvesting that money elsewhere in our societies and actually using that money more productively, we might say, to actually deal with the crisis? And the other question, which comes from Nigel Rawlinson, who I understand is the university chaplain, who points out that humans are meant to be together in the same actual space. How do we protect existing and develop new ways of human contact? No touch, no handshake, and the importance of seeing. How do we see ourselves through this crisis in that way? So I will allow each of the speakers now in turn to answer either or both of those very quickly, please, if possible.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, on the first one, the first question around militarization and whether or not we can change things. Growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, I was near a large naval air base. So even though it wasn't close to the sea, it was a naval air base. And the interesting thing is, in the early 1990s, you started to see these bumper stickers that said, basically, give the schools all the money they need and let the Air Force raise money for its or sell cookies to buy its planes or something like that. And so it was really, in a sense, kind of turning things on its head and saying that actually there are a lot of areas of the state that actually require some kind of investment, and we seem to be prioritizing the military. The interesting thing is that, of course, in the UK in particular, our investment in the military has continued to go down since 1991, and so therefore it's difficult for us to, even though the United States, China, Russia, Turkey, Greece, and Poland, for the most part, spend the most money on defense, and so therefore, the point of that $2 trillion that is the UK or many European states, in fact, has continually gone down since that time, and so therefore, we don't imagine. So we've already been seeing, in a sense, a redistribution away from the Ministry of Defence and the military in the UK towards other areas. But in most cases, what's happened is that money has just disappeared. And so it's not gone into social policy and it's not gone into the NHS. It's simply disappeared. The final issue around communication is a fascinating one, Nigel, and I think that the one that probably I'm not wholly cut out to answer, but I will say this: we're not quite sure the significance of this crisis and how long it will last and what kind of impact it's going to have. But prior to, in a sense, the creation of antibiotics, of course, we were having to deal with epidemics and pandemics on a regular basis, and so therefore, all the culture that we've received up until this point really have already been, they've already suffered more than we had in the last 3 months. So I would say that we'll continue to shake hands in time to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quickly in response to the first question on military expenditure, I think it's interesting that although in this country the military seem to have been involved, I think particularly in the building of the Nightingale hospitals, there doesn't seem to have been much media attention on that and much coverage of that, and that seems interesting. It seems that the military are a huge resource to be exploited at this time, and it is interesting that perhaps the kind of public relations element perhaps of that hasn't been kind of as pointed as it might have been. And secondly, on the second lovely question about how do we encourage and sustain human contact beyond this, I think that's a huge and a very deep question, and I don't think I have a kind of pithy response to it. But I do think that one kind of positive coming out of this whole thing has been people communicating and reaching out to each other in new ways, and I think there's been a huge emphasis on art and public art in this country. Things like the National Theatre putting productions online, and other theatres doing the same, and museums and galleries reaching out to people via new ways, and just new methods of communication and technology, new ways of people being together online in various ways for the first time. So I think it has shown that physical distance is not necessarily a barrier to communication and to family and to friends, and like David, I think that hopefully soon we will be shaking hands and seeing family and living more normal lives in the near future.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit to what's been said. I mean, I think it's right to say that defence expenditure has already been cut quite considerably in countries like the UK, certainly since the Second World War. And really, for us, the big challenge is to think about how we fund our public services, particularly health and social care, in an ageing society. When even before this pandemic, we were looking at 1 to 2% of GDP needing to go on to our health services, our social care services, our pensions, etc., to pay for an ageing society. So I think there will be some really big debates about public spending after this crisis and what our priorities are. I suspect the answer to them won't be found, I'm afraid, just in cutting defence expenditure. On this final question, Nigel's question of human interaction, I mean, of course, human beings are tactile. Touch is important to us. Interaction with other human beings is a part of who we are. But I do want us to not lose sight of this question of our relationship to the natural world as well, and to how we conceive of our responsibilities to nature, to biodiversity, not just about climate change, but to all the things that we have witnessed around us. We've been able to hear birdsong, breathe clear air, and to think about why it is that nature has responded so violently to some of the ways in which we've colonised its spaces in recent decades. And that question, I think we mustn't lose sight of too.
Thanks, everybody. I think ending on our shared responsibility to one another seems quite a poignant position to end on this session. So thanks very much. And I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank each of the speakers for their contributions today. That's been very informative. And I also want to thank the public engagement, marketing and technical staff behind all this. Without their participation, none of this would have been possible. So the next in the series will explore the science of the virus, and that will be at the same time on May the 29th. You can sign up again on Eventbrite for this. You'll also, those who sign up today, you'll be sent a short survey, which we'll ask you to kindly fill out. Your feedback is very important and valuable to us moving forward with these series. So I hope you will find the time to be able to do that. So it just leaves me to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you find it meaningful and informative. So until the next time, please take care. Thank you.